Welcome to the Must Reads video series sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence, where we interview authors about some of the really great homiletical works being written these days. I'm Wes Allen, and I teach preaching at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. And today I have with me Sarah Travis, who's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church of Canada and teaches preaching at Knox College, University of Toronto. And her work is on the cutting edge of homiletics. She's written 3 books, the first one on preaching in relation to post-colonialism, then preaching in a post-Christendom age, and now her 3rd book deals with preaching in relation to trauma. It was just published earlier this year by Cascade Books and is entitled Unspeakable, Preaching and Trauma-Informed Theology. Dr. Travis, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let me just ask right off the bat, why this book, why this topic, why now?
Well, believe it or not, I finished the final draft of the manuscript in February 2020. So immediately before COVID hit. So I had to go back and kind of add COVID in as a significant traumatizing event, which it is. I mean, there's almost 700,000 people dead in the United States alone. And it's been an event that has brought out trauma. It's a triggering event for so many people, being left alone in isolation. The death is massive. So the timing of this book could not be more perfect. We're surrounded by trauma. Some people have experienced racial trauma. Some people experience intergenerational trauma or domestic violence, or just the trauma of watching the news and watching and trying to interpret what God can possibly be doing in a world like this one. I've been carrying, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, when you talk in the book about all the different kinds of trauma, it's very clear that we've always been a trauma-laden species, if you will. And you talk about scripture growing out of trauma. And it's amazing that we've not talked about this more in relation to preaching.
Yes. I think it's one of the lessons of this pandemic is that we realize how much trauma we carry in ourselves, not only as listeners, but as preachers. And it's so important to gather up that trauma and try and understand it, because it will impact how we preach. I talk in the book about the experience of my son's death, which I carried around for 13 years now. And it continues to be a traumatizing experience, but it was certainly one of the motivators for writing this book. That my experience as a grieving person led me to understand that preaching does not always take adequate responsibility for representing grief and trauma.
I thought that was a powerful part of the book, and it's not an autobiographical book by any sense of that kind of a memoir or something, but that really informs a reading of the book. And you tell about your own experience in an Advent service where you just couldn't stay because it was being sort of just washed over, at least for you at the moment. And so that brings me to a core part of your book, a sort of a thread that runs through the whole weaving. And you name that we preachers, we're wired to want to offer good news that we believe fixes things. And we want to the good news. But at the center of your proposal is that when we preach to those who are traumatized or addressing a global trauma, et cetera, we need to not rush so fully into the good news that we re-victimize the traumatized. So can you explain what you mean by preaching in between death and life instead of rushing too quickly to celebrate life overcoming death?
I talk in the book about having a conversation with a friend who had experienced every kind of trauma, and all I wanted to do was say, well, what about resurrection? What about making everything okay? How can I make everything okay? And I think we use resurrection like that sometimes as preachers, that it's a state that we are trying to get to as fast as possible. But trauma doesn't go there. Trauma waits. It waits in this space in between life and death, because there's this sense of continuing to live with this ongoing presence of death in your life. So there's an intermingling of death and life. And I think this book really tries to get us to stay there, at least for a while. I talk about the space of Holy Saturday, and how it's a profound space that we may skip over without even meaning to. And it's a space that we can use every week, not just in Holy Week. It's a space that makes us pause and think and wonder about the experiences of trauma.
You know, I don't know if they do this in Canada and the US now, you're seeing more and more sort of blue Christmas services where there's a liturgy late in Advent that recognizes this is not a time of celebration for everyone. We get to lament. And I thought about that. We usually skip from Good Friday to Easter, and Holy Saturday, both literally and metaphorically, serve as that in-between time that could really be lifted up for people to acknowledge that, yes, I still have sort of eschatological hope, but right now, I can't be there.
Right, right.
So, I mean, I think preachers a lot think about ways that we offer pastoral care in the pulpit, but trauma is bigger than just sort of the way we often think about that care as momentary and all. One of the images you use in the book as you talk about resurrection is that Jesus still carries the scars of the crucifixion after him. And I wonder, you know, we preachers we're once and done people often. We preach the funeral, then we're sort of done, or we preach about this issue and we're done. But what would your advice be for preachers in terms of dealing with the long-term effects of trauma and preaching week in and week out?
Mm-hmm. And I think it does need to be a week in, week out kind of thing. Trauma, those Blue Christmas services are fantastic, but how do we make space for that within our regular weekly worship services? I think that's really important. I think that preachers also need to be educated about how our theology shapes our preaching. If we have a theology that rushes to the resurrection, if we have a theology of glory or a theology that avoids the cross, then we're not doing a service to the people who are listening to us.
It really does invite us to think about salvation outside the box of the cliched language that we've inherited. Not that we have to abandon, you know, those different views of atonement and all, but it requires us to open up and think in some more tentative ways.
Yes.
Salvation looks like.
Yes, and that tentative gospel may get me in trouble from some, because it sounds like a watered down gospel message, but it isn't. It's recognizing that the fullness of gospel lies between life and death.
I mean, in some ways, it's the classic definition of eschatology, of living between the already and not yet, except you put flesh and bones on that with trauma in a way that really helps us see the importance of that and moving beyond just thinking of that chronologically and thinking about it experientially, always living in between the already and not yet. Well, I just want to thank you for giving us a little bit of time. I want to thank you for this book. I want to recommend it to all of you watching this video. This will enhance your preaching ministry and it'll touch the way you do pastoral care and the ways you think about liturgy. So I would really recommend you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore and get a copy of Unspeakable, Preaching and the Trauma-Informed Theology. Sarah, thank you. for spending a little time with me.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.